When organizations talk about learning, what they often are exploring is effectiveness. They want to become more effective, to help people individually to do things better and collectively to deliver a different type of capability. But they don't do so in a neutral environment. We've seen the emergence of generative AI at scale impacting on learning and our organizations and society more broadly. And in this series, I want to explore the impacts of generative AI on learning, and particularly on social and collaborative learning in the flow of work. So we can think about the broad context of learning before generative AI ever came into our widespread public consciousness. Learning has already been changing. We've been moving away from a model of learning which has been codified and centralized and distributed through formal infrastructure, through to a really significantly distributed and diversified model. Some of the social technologies like YouTube and TikTok have meant anybody can be a content creator. They can share their wisdom, knowledge, interpretation, and insight. And even within organizations, we've seen much more widespread adoption of social and collaborative models of learning. Although, interestingly, we haven't always seen such an evolution of their approaches to measurement, so sometimes we end up with a tension between social and formal models of learning. Against this backdrop, we've seen social collaborative technologies radically connecting us, the emergence and empowerment of communities at breadth. Our own research shows people belonging on average to 15 different communities to help them to be effective, and a general rebalancing of power away from organizations and indeed the broader formal structures of our society and into social collectives. So our communities, in a very real sense, are becoming political forces within our organizations, and the individual with high social authority, something we consider in the work on social leadership, is going to hold a certain type of power, and organizations have to listen. Indeed, we can view engagement within organizations as an increasingly negotiated phenomena between the individual, the collective, and the formal structural organization. We could argue that knowledge itself is shifting, which might be a bold statement to make, but in many practical ways it is. We're not relying so much on formally validated knowledge. We're relying on distributed, co-created, dynamic, adaptive, evolutionary forms of knowledge, some of which is pretty rubbish, and some of which is pretty good. The key thing to consider here is that our mechanisms of validation are themselves evolving, and we saw this through the birth of Wikipedia. What started off as something not terribly accurate learnt to become more accurate. So our social structures of sense-making are evolving, and indeed our individual understanding of validity and mechanisms of validation may be evolving. Whether it's evolving fast enough is a rather open question, but we are being pushed down this highway. We're heading towards a place where knowledge is distributed, and the creation of meaning in our own heads and between us becomes increasingly significant. In the book I published in 2019 on the socially dynamic organisation, I considered what this means in terms of organisational design, how we may want to conceive of the organisation overall as a formal structure and a social structure, or in fact, many concurrent parallel layers of social structure. And a socially dynamic organisation understands this. It holds great formal strength and great social strength. So the backdrop to think about the impacts of generative AI on learning within organisations is to understand that the ecosystem that we live within, in my work I would call that the context of the social age, has shifted. We are more connected, our power is more distributed, and we have strongly emergent structures of social communities or indeed new guild-type structures. Our organisations increasingly want our invested engagement. They want our ideas and our discretionary investment of our energy. And indeed, if you hire me, you don't just hire me, you hire my community, access to my network, if I choose to give it to you. So we don't just trade in the currency of hard cash. we also trade in the social currencies. So this is the backdrop, and generative AI comes into this mix. And what I want to explore in this series is going to be how generative AI will impact on learning and indeed the effectiveness of our organisations.